Good evening. Tonight's story is the delightful tale of The Chicken Market by Henry Morley. This tale comes from a collection of Morley's short stories published in 1877. In The Chicken Market, a country farmer decides to take his chickens into fairyland where he thinks he'll get a better price. It is an offbeat fairy tale. It's a bit surreal, a bit allegorical, a bit humorous, but it is also surprisingly wholesome and beautifully written. Honestly, it's a treat, and you will get to hear me make a few ridiculous chicken noises. So now, let's open our imaginations and begin. Chapter 1. Ben Odie is resolved on carrying his chickens to a pretty market. Once upon a time there was a rustic whose name was Ben Odie, and he knew more of what was in an egg than is something good to eat. He understood how one thing comes out of another. Ben Odie, when he had no more sense than the rest of the world, kept fowls, and when he grew to be so wise, he had been carrying his chickens to a pretty market. There is a woody wilderness in Dolman's Land, and few reach to the heart of it. But there is open market held by fairies in the middle of that wilderness, and any man who gets to it may talk and traffic with the market people to his own great gain. Ben Odie knew that there was such a market, and resolved to carry thither a large basket full of chickens. Goody Madge Odie cried down his design. Chickens, she said, were worth 3 shillings a couple in their own good town of Pennyworth, and that was their just price all the world over. He might grind down his legs from under him in traveling to the strange market, and find, she would answer for it, nobody but a fool to pay a shilling more. Ben Odie made answer to his wife that she talked like a woman, and then set out like a man upon his journey. He had not gone 10 steps from his door before he met somebody who offered him 4 shillings a pair for all his chickens. But Goodman Ben refused the money, saying to himself, one has not to go far to find a fool. He hadn't gone 10 miles before he met somebody who offered for his chickens 4 shillings apiece. Should he halt on his way to fairyland because he was tempted by so great a certainty of present gain? Odie covered up the basket with his pocket handkerchief and traveled on. The very chickens cried cheep, cheep to one another when the bargain was proposed. I hope for better luck than that, said Odie as he went on his way. A forward young hen who was of the company in the basket, getting her head, after a little perseverance, through one of the holes in her master's handkerchief, turned up one eye at him and clucked, "Lock, lock, lock." He could not tell whether she spoke in sympathy or in derision. For, to the last, as wise as he became, Ben Odie could not arrive at the whole and exact mind, even of a hen. On the first night of his journey, Goodman Ben, when he came to an inn, supped upon juicy steak with oyster sauce and bought wheat for his poultry. On the second night he had cold shoulder and fed the chickens upon bran. On the third night he had sour milk for supper and a very little bread, of which he gave all to his birds. Should he halt on his way to fairyland because he was repelled by so great a certainty of present hunger? On the fourth night he supped at a pig trough and slept in a barn, upon the floor of which his hens found pickings. On the 5th night he came to the sea coast, where a keen wind, blustering from the east, cruelly threatened to cut off his nose and ears. The wild waves chomped on the restraining bit of shore, tossing abroad white flakes of foam. Behind the flying foam flakes the wind raced like a starved hound, whining. There was rough water stirring eagerly, flashing white lines, reflecting from the tempestuous sky, just quitted by the sun, a ghastly yellow light. But in the west, water and air were heavy with the purple gloom that buried all, and was not to be cloven even by the stroke of all the lightnings in it. Who could tell when it was from the wind, when from the wave, when from the cloud that thunder came? In that fierce tumult a man's ears were stuffed with the incessant roar, his eyes filled with the rising of great waters, and the rising also of their own small flood under the pinch of wind that had a grip on every nerve. The tongue within the mouth was salted, and all juices of the flesh seemed to be brine. A driving rain began to whip the goodman in the face. No shelter was to be had in the low red crags behind him or on the flat, treeless land above. Beyond a gap in the cliffs, far away by a white sea mark, a boathouse could be seen, but there was between the drenched man and that mockery of shelter a wide, wet bog and the estuary of a river. Then fell upon his mind's ear the voice of his goody, who talked like a woman, and upon his mind's eye a vision of the marketplace of Pennyworth that was now left 5 days' journey behind his back. The chickens all were become cheerless, cold fowls without tongue. Ben Odie had their basket by this time under his gabardine that dripped and flapped over them, a dismal substitute for the warm mother's wing under which they could still remember how they once were nursed. Suddenly, through the splashing of the rain, light shone from their owner's countenance. Sore hunger, prompter of his wit, reminded him that he knew, as every man may know, 1 sentence at least of the speech of hens. The hint given him from the basket at the outset of his journey, which it had been then suited his humor to consider English, belonged naturally to one of the languages of the great poultry stock, and was, in fact, Hennish for "I am about to lay an egg." "Where," he cried in his stomach, "is that egg? For eggs are good to eat, and I am desperately hungry." There was a flutter in the basket, followed by a delicate rap on his elbow. Was that a mouse running down his sleeve? The egg was in his hand. "Ha," said the countryman. "The egg's alive. It can't be eatable." But Ben Odie put the 2 ends of the egg to his lips and found one cold, the other hot. Right enough, he thought. So he made for himself a hole in the small end, sucked thereat, and was nearly choked before he knew that what he swallowed was tobacco smoke. What wonder! Again and again had he prophesied to Goody and said, "Goody, we shall have the poultry copying the puppies, and the chickens will soon learn to smoke before they break the shell." How this young embryo came by his cigars was only one out of 1,000 mysteries of the tobacco trade. Ben Odie peeped into the eggshell, and the smoke immediately stung him in the eye. He might as well hope to look down a chimney when fresh wood has been laid on the fire below. Meantime, the wind howled and the sea roared in his ears, the rain lashed his face, and the salt spray leapt into his mouth as his teeth chattered with cold. The tobacco smoke curled up from the egg like the smoke of a fusee that has burnt close to another sort of shell. "Next to only victuals comes tobacco," sighed the weary man. "After you, therefore, if you please, my little chicken." A wisp of dead herbage was blowing by, and a bit of stout reed in it caught Ben's attention. "I will have you," he thought, "for a pipe stem," and accordingly he thrust one end of it through a convenient part of the shell. Immediately, a venerable head, as big as an old pea, as yellow and as wrinkled, but having as much white beard as a dozen dandelion seeds, thrust itself from inside through a hole of its own breaking, and cried, "How many more draughts are you going to expose me to, young man?" "I beg your pardon, sir," Ben Odie said. "You are no chicken." "Why are you standing out there in the rain?" said the little man, still in a rage. "How much damp are you going to bring in with you? Now then, the supper will get cold as well as you." Whether he himself had become smaller or the egg had become larger, Ben could not then tell, for he had no point of comparison as he stood there in the tempest with his face toward the boundless sea. Moreover, he was a man on such terms with himself that in the most reduced condition he could not feel small. He could not, indeed, fail to perceive that his chicken basket towered high above his head, its wicker sides rising like columns of a temple in which there were enshrined sublime hens and a cock holding his head higher than any weathercock in Dulman's land. But what a fine lime-whited hermitage, tapestried inside from dome to floor with the most exquisite of tissues, was the vaulted chamber he had taken for an egg. Therein sat the yellow man, and by no means a little man, beside a fire hot enough to have parched his pea of a head, which now seemed to be as big as a ripe pumpkin. And there he knocked out the dead ashes from his pipe before he turned his chair round to the supper table. The rain splashed and the wind howled outside, while the wide dome that sheltered them rocked like a great ship in the storm. For supper, there was a bee's thigh stewed in its own burden of honey, and Ben Odie was so hungry that he ate slice after slice and feasted on the honey till his clothes began to feel too tight for him.
"Now," said the yellow hermit, "my name's Yoke. You are my guest, sir, and I am your servant. What do you take?"
Here he produced 2 round bottles from a cupboard, each warranted to hold an exact, unbroken dewdrop.
"This," he said, "is thistledew, and this has been distilled on woodbine blossom."
Then Yoke broke the seal of one bottle carefully, produced a couple of cups, and shared with his guest a drop of thistledew, at which they drank and drank till Prudence counseled them to leave a little in the bottle. Odie hardly knew what he had been talking about, so much had the dew risen to his head, when at last his servant became angry and began to beat the table, shouting again and again,
"Shut your hand firmly upon what you want, and there you have it."
Then Ben Odie shut his hand, and there were barley corns forcing their way out between his fingers. He shut both hands firmly, opened them side by side so that he made a scoop out of his 2 palms, and the scoop was at once full to overflowing of good barley. Then he knew that what he had been arguing about was supper for his fowls, and he went out to feed them. Chapter 2. Over the Sea. The storm was over, though the sea raged still against the land, but no star shone. The moon, breaking for an instant through a rift in the clouds, made the wet, glistening shore so light that one of his colossal chickens, having spied the goodman as he clambered up the side of a pebble, mistook him for a grub, and, being peckish, made a snap at him.
"You would not," said Yoke, laughing at Ben's escape, "have been the first man eaten up by his own chickens when traveling this way to market. You have held to your mind with them, and they are your own. Treasure them. Golden eggs are a mere goose's business to the eggs they lay, but they may eat you up nevertheless. We are yours, yet have a care, Master Ben Odie. You are ours."
"Dear Mr. Yoke, what must I do?"
"Go on."
"Through the sea, I suppose?"
"Certainly through the sea. This is the sea of trouble through which you must go, unless you will return to Pennyworth."
"But here is every hen as large as a parsonage, and a cock bigger than our parish church. I might as well leave them alone to find their suppers. If they grow at this rate, nothing smaller than a sea serpent will be the worm any one of them will scratch for. What ship is to carry them?"
"There is no ship to carry them," said Yoke.
"Very well. To fellows of that size, the sea is a puddle. But for myself, where am I to find a little skiff, a mere cockboab? What if it were but an eggshell?" And Ben cast a wistful look upon the hermitage.
"Go on," said Yoke. "I only stay behind to let the fowls out of the basket. You may trust us all to follow."
"The night is pitch dark, Mr. Yoke. The sea and the wind are buffeting and tearing at each other. Here is the tide rising, and a wave at its first innings has almost bowled me down." For a minute there escaped a ray of moonlight from the storm above. It fled like a white spirit and vanished suddenly across the waste of surging waters. Under its touch there had flashed into sight, pale and still, the tall figure of Yoke, with one arm raised and a long finger pointing seaward.
"Courage, Ben Odie. Dare and overcome. Turn neither to the right nor to the left. Go on resolved, and you will reach the fairy market."
The rustic put faith in the exhortation, and his heart enlarged within him. "Shut your hand firmly upon what you want, and there you have it." "Courage!" Ben Odie cried, with both fists clenched, beating the waves back as they struck him on the brow. He was among them, and his large tread became heavy on the corals of the sea bottom as his frame grew to the measure of his grand audacity. Sharks leaping about him worried him as fleas worry a dog. Great whales gathered in shoals and joined their forces in wild rushes at his legs, as well might earwigs hope to trip the heels of a prize-fighter. "Mr. Yoke," said Odie when they were halfway across, "it seems to me that this is pretty night work for a man whose supper was but a few slices out of a bee's leg and half a dewdrop."
"It is getting to be all spirit with you, Mr. Odie," said the man out of the egg. "Your courage is not of the sort they cut up with a knife and fork. Starvation strengthens it. There is meat enough on a bee's leg to give mettle to the man who is resolved. So here we are, safe out of deep water and sure-footed among the shallows. This rain is but the earth's morning wash, for there, you see, rises the sun over the sandhills."
"Well," Odie said, "I have had my wash, and now if I could only polish myself with a towel, give my hair a handsome combing, and brush my old smock and boots and gaiters into something fit to be looked at."
"Look, look, look here!" clucked a voice behind him.
"That's the voice of the speckled hen, I know," said Ben, turning upon her.
"Speckled? Why, Yoke, are those my chickens? Was that sea a beauty bath?"
Though a hummingbird grew to the size of an ostrich and increased as much in beauty as in size, it would be no match for one of Ben Odie's chickens as those chickens now shone in the dawn. They had crossed the water and stood glittering among the dull sandhills like hillocks of rainbow in the morning rain. "3 shillings a couple, did you say, Madge? And that glorious being yonder," whispered the rustic, "is my speckled hen, for it is she who has demeaned herself to lay me an egg for my breakfast. Here it is." But as Goodman Odie took it up, the shell broke in his hand, and there fell out of it a small clothes-brush, a comb, and a large towel. When Ben Odie rubbed his face dry with this towel, soft and delicate as any spider's web, though stronger than chain cable, the wrinkles and the freckles and the stubble of his beard came away with the water. His crooked nose, kneaded up in it for a moment, became as the nose of an Apollo, and his old mouth blossomed again with its early roses. He dug the comb into his hair and shook out exquisite odors while he pulled the grizzled mat into brown silken tresses. He brushed at his smock, his boots, and his gaiters, clearing away all that was rustic as he rubbed. The smock brushed out into a purple velvet robe enriched with a fine gold embroidery and fringed with amethysts. The gaiters, when their shell of dirt had been cleared off, displayed an inner crust of diamonds, and the old hobnail boots, which, with the feet inside, were filed down by 1 minute's brushing to a dainty size and shape, cleaned into easy slippers of rich orange morocco with red heels. At the same time there came a sensation of silk and fine linen over the entire body and legs of Mr. Odie.
"Now, master, that you've done polishing yourself," said Yoke, "will you oblige me with the brush and towel?"
Yoke cleaned himself into the figure of a black-haired page in a fall suit of amber satin. Still there was a touch of bile in his complexion, but his face was smooth, and the long white bristles of his beard had shrunk into a tender down upon the chin. Upon his upper lip the towel left only a slender black moustache of hair that might be in the very first month of its crispness.
"There's nothing," he said, "so refreshing as a good rub with a towel when one has been hard at work all night."
"Except breakfast," observed my Lord Ben. "Towels and combs and yellow pages are all very well, but my intention was to eat that egg."
"Shut your hand firmly upon what you want, and there you have it. Call for what breakfast you please, master."
"Oh, certainly. A pint of old ale and a muffin. There, Yellow Page, the muffin is for you, the ale for me."
"May I be permitted to suggest that if I had as much might in my hands as you in yours, I should know how to choose myself a better breakfast?"
"Throw the muffin to the fowls if you don't like it. Stay, I beg your pardon for remembering old ways. At Pennyworth I had my morning draught, and Madge, she had her muffin. Hold that muffin for a minute, and keep it hot as you can, while I shut my hand upon my goody. There, I have her. With her mob cap and her false red wig, her tortoiseshell spectacles, her turn-up nose and the one front tooth in her mouth, with her old flowered gown tucked up about her waist and a black petticoat flapping over the wrinkles of her grey worsted stockings, with her feet raised upon pattens, her bare shriveled arms still wet to the elbows with soap-suds, and a dripping lump of mottled soap in her right hand, while her left hand slipped greasily out of her husband's grasp, there stood Goody Madge. "Let me give you a rub, Goody, with this towel."
"I'll have no spider's webs thrust in my mouth. Keep off, I say. None of your play acting with me."
After only a week's parting, do you not remember Ben again? Have I not been fighting alone through my trouble, and do I not give you my hand now I am fairly through that sea and safe to find my way into the fairy chicken market?
My Ben certainly left Pennyworth on a fool's errand with a basket full of chickens, but if you are he, you've altered greatly for the worse. What other sign am I to know you by?
A morning muffin.
And that morning draught, I see. But who's the boy?
He's the yellow boy who waits upon me.
What have you done with the hens?
Look yonder. What do you think of them? 3 shillings a couple in our marketplace, and if I take them further I shall only find a fool to pay a shilling more?
Nonsense, Ben. Fine feathers don't make fine fowls. How will they roast?
They glorify me. They give power to my hands. They give me back more than my youth. They grow without food. They are the delight of my eyes. And am I, because in our old marketplace nothing but bread and meat is bartered for, to wring their necks and sell them for the pot?
Alack! Alack! Alack!
Cried a voice from the sand heaps.
That's the black hen's voice, said Mrs. Marjorie. I'll go look for her egg.
Chapter 3. Through Waste and Wilderness. The light rain had passed away, and mist was rolling from the earth as the sun rose. Yoke laid a hand on Odie's wrist and, drawing close to him, looked with an awed face landward. On the verge of the land, where the last blades of coarse grass were waving in the sea wind, the outline visible against the sky was indistinctly broken by the gleam of some white, ruined gravestones and the swelling up of graves. A heavy mist was rolling upward from that undefended graveyard on the border of the sea. Within the mist, and part of it, were solemn shapes that spread themselves abroad, the shapes of ghostly grave-diggers, each with a black mattock in his hand.
They are gone, master. I saw them sitting on the shore waiting for us.
For us?
Go up, master, and see those graves. They are all marked with plain stones. Not a name ever was carved on one of them. Here the storm beats and the lichen grows. This headstone was beaten down upon its grave when the blast of the night wind shrieked over the forgotten dead. They were all wrecked men whom the ghosts have buried, working silently and leaving not a trace beyond the hillock and a headstone such as these.
Goodman Odie shivered. This hole in the sand was made for me, no doubt, and I observe now that the shore is lined with heaps of chicken bones.
Many a man, said Yoke, carrying his chickens to the fairy market, has been taken dead out of this sea of trouble. When the resolve falters in the midst of peril, all is lost. Every man cannot shut his hand firmly upon what he wants. That young husband, upon whose grave the fallen stone lies heavy, had the fondest heart alive. He flinched and died when the salt wave reminded him of tears of little children on his cheek. Then, as he picked a bunch of wormwood from this grave, there came upon Ben Odie's ear the voice of his goody, crying, "Come down, man! Here's the black hen's egg, only she isn't black, and a pretty egg it is for your fine feathers to lay. It's empty."
"Stop," answered the goodman. "Stop till I come.
Now, crack that egg, and you shall see what you shall see come out of it. Well, goody, what is it?"
"My wedding ring," said the old dame.
"And that is curious. When you were 3 days away, I was vexed at you and took it off and put it away in a teapot. How came it here? How came I here? How you came to be so foolish? What has come to the chickens? Who that young man is, and what is coming to us all? Who knows?"
"Never mind, Marjorie. Put out your finger, and on goes the ring again. Is there any spell in it, I wonder, Mr. Yoke? How do you feel now, Madge?"
"I feel like sticking by you, Ben."
"Then may the black hen lay nothing but wedding rings, and may I be the jeweler that sells them. On we go. My love's as old as yours, Goody, although the matter of the chickens puts a difference between us. You'd shine like a queen if you would only scrub your face well with this towel."
"I'm Goody Madge, and I don't wish to be transmogrified."
"Then, Goody, you shall not even put your pattens off. So take my arm, old woman, and come on." The forward road lay through a vast sandy plain filled with rabbit holes. The fowls, glittering with all colors that play in the diamond, led the way and were as a rainbow of hope moving before them. Ben Odie, beautiful in his new youth, walked lovingly with his old wife, who, having shaken down her flounced gown and wiped her arms upon her apron, put the bit of mottled soap into her pocket and was carrying her pattens in her hand. She did not care about the splendor of his newly gotten youth. He did not care about her wrinkles and gray hairs. The bells had rung for them both, years ago, from Pennyworth church steeple. There was one memory, one heart between them. Yoke described the road.
These, he said, were the famous warrens of mockery on the confines of Dulman's land.
Ben was pleased with the ways of the little rabbits that ran out of their holes to nibble and make mouths at him. They were so free with Goody's heel that she put on her pattens again to protect her toes from their incessant nibbling. They were thus bold because they saw her dread of them. Ben Odie's slippers were proof against all their bites. Shrubs became numerous, in which venomous snakes hissed as they passed. Trees multiplied, and, following their chickens, the wayfarers soon were buried in the great forest or wilderness of doubt.
By the straight path, on and be resolved, Yoke whispered.
Everywhere there was to be heard the roaring of a lion around the corner, but none ever leapt out to dispute the forward way. As the forest darkened and the night set in, and the moon threw only a stray spear shaft of light among the trees, Goody said under her breath,
I go where you go, Ben, but I have heard laughter at men who took their chickens to a pretty market, and I have some fear of what it means.
Ben answered with a brave word, crushed the bunch of wormwood in his hand, and steadily went on. Chapter 4. The Market Reached.
Did you see that, Ben?
Yes, what was it?
Flash of eyes. There are queer people about us in the wood, and they make no sound. One of them ran against me and walked through me and could not be felt. Hark, Ben, what voice is that?
The nightingale.
Oh, husband, I wish we were well through the wood.
That's a bold cock of ours to blow his clarion against the nightingale, said Ben. There is a distant answer. Trumpet music that comes nearer and nearer. There's a chorus coming with it. Hark, old girl, hark to the words. We must be getting on to our journey's end. Make way through the press, oh yes, to the never despairing, the manfully daring. Market is open, oh yes, oh yes. Then, under the gloomy forest paths, the chickens all began to shine with their own light. The wood was full of spirit lamps, for every lamp was a fairy. The glorious procession was seen coming onward like the miracle of a bright sunbeam in the midst of night. There was no light but that which issued from the robes and the beaming faces of the fairies. On each side of the path the fairies stood in treble line, face over face. Behind and above these keepers of the way, among the trees and on the trees, a frolicsome crowd made with its happiness a wall of light that shone reflected from Ben Odie in his royal purple and Madge in her figured cotton gown. Hemmed in by fairy faces, of which every one looked lovingly upon her Ben, a little dazzled by the light, a little troubled with embarrassment about her pattens, the Goody took a firm grip of her husband's arm and happily marched on. The path led to the open space of the great fairy market, which was hemmed in by the dark forest of doubt. The moon stood over it, large and round, but the whole market was filled in part with its own emerald light from the robes of the fairies, in part with the white and rosy radiance of their faces, and the glitter of a crowd of eyes brighter than stars that cluster in the Milky Way. Goody Madge was beset by praises of her chickens, and her heart warmed at the sound of merry traffic from fragrant alcoves cut out of the forest. She felt no more concern about her pattens. Nobody heeded them, and yet it seemed that everybody heeded her and her goodman. "What shall I give you for these chickens, mortal dame?" a busy elf asked of the Goody.
3 shillings and a couple, madam, was their price at Pennyworth, but—
"Shillings? What are shillings, you dear friend? Wit or beauty, troth to duty, strength to conquer or obey, heart to give well, soul to live well, such alone is fairies' pay." "That's a funny sort of money," said Old Madge, almost in rhyme. Then another fairy whispered, "Don't be eager. Bide your time." Goodman Ben Odie spoke with Yoke, and then he began to sing. "All the fowls that hither we bring, body and legs, liver and wing, we mean to present to the fairy king." Then there was more music and more chorusing, and in the middle of the marketplace, Oberon, who descended in the form of a moonbeam, became visibly present on a bed of night flowers there laid for him. The burden of the chorus changed when in a ring of dancing light the fairies stood about the royal couch and fixed their eyes upon Ben Odie and his wife as they were left alone together in the great space opposite the king. "To you he descends, you are his friends, to the never despairing, the manfully daring. Oberon speaks, and the world attends." "Your chickens shall come into my barnyard, Goodman Odie," said the king. "What shall I give you more than thanks for them?" "Only your hand to kiss," Ben stammered. The circle of the fairies closed in on the goodman and his wife as Oberon stretched forth his royal hand. Ben stood erect when he had kissed it, erect even when he saw the fairy king rise from his couch and, bending reverently over it, himself kiss the brown, wrinkled hand of the old goody. "Goodman Ben Odie," said his majesty, "you that have kissed the hand of Oberon are minded to go back to Pennyworth and dig with a new strength in your own farm. Out of the fullness of your heart, as of your hand, you will deal wisely, liberally, gently with your fellows. The wiser you become, the better will you feel why Oberon paid homage to your faithful wife. Dame Marjorie requires none of your fairy lore. Look down, fortunate husband, into the old eyes under her spectacles, and learn to read in them the greater mysteries of a good woman's soul." Marjorie's hand shook, and her pattens clicked together as she heard these fine things said about herself. It was odd that they should make her think of her lame youngest boy, the cowherd, and a great deal more curious that he should take that very time to pull the bobbin and come limping in over the stone floor of her kitchen. Never before was known such easy traveling as the return from Oberon's court into the old house place. Ben, in his usual smock, and with the usual freckles and wrinkles, was only fetching his spade out of the tool house. But there had been no dreaming. The chickens were gone, and, in a suit of corduroy, a fair-sized ploughboy, with a face yellow and seamed as an old pea, there was Yoke, smoking his pipe in the chimney corner. I just love this story. I love how it's this fun, strange little fairy tale. It's got lots of humor, it's got lots of adventure, but it also has this wonderful relationship right at the heart of it with this old couple who have this deep and abiding bond, who accept and support and love each other through everything. There are so many stories where the wife doesn't even have a name, or the husband goes off to a new country and there gets a new wife, or where the old woman is repulsive and mocked by everyone. This story treats Goody Madge with so much care and respect, and it's really delightful to see. Henry Morley is one of England's most famous professors and educators of the English language. He's best remembered as the editor of educational book series, Morley's Universal Library, Cassell's National Library, and a book series on English writers. In all of these massive, ambitious projects, he collected and edited the most important works of literature, trying to make them accessible for ordinary people. He also wrote numerous biographies of writers, he edited dozens of smaller volumes, he wrote introductions. Meanwhile, he was one of the most productive and popular professors of English at University College London, principal of a research library, and a strong advocate for women's education. He was also a prolific writer of short fiction, much of which appeared in various periodicals during his time, but for which he is not really remembered today. Obviously, I think that's a terrible omission. This is a completely charming story, and the book it came from is equally delightful. I will, of course, link the text in the description so you can read it yourself on archive.org. I think everybody should read it and appreciate this other dimension to Morley's skill and his character. This edition of the book was illustrated by Charles Henry Bennett, whose images appear in this video. In a weird coincidence, I have been obsessed with one of Bennett's allegorical emblems for months now, this one, but I had no idea where it came from until I was looking him up for this story and found these remarkable images on Wikimedia Commons. Also, I highly recommend reading Bennett's Wikipedia page for a laugh. As you know, if you listen all the way to the end, I make a little confession out here. This week's confession is that I had a completely different story in mind for this week, and I've been trying not to read any more fairy tales because I already have years of stories I want to share with you, more than I could ever record. But this particular story was so delightful, and Morley is just the type of overlooked author that I want to feature on the channel. And then, I'm not superstitious, but I am a little stitious, so when I saw these images from Bennett and realized that I had been staring at one of them for months now, I felt like it just had to be. I hope you agree. This is Restored Lore, where I find the rare and fantastic, the obscure and dramatic, and share these stories with new readers and new audiences. If you like this kind of thing, then like, share, subscribe, comment. You know what YouTube likes. Sleep well, everybody, and I'll see you next week.